Good morning, everyone. You all can do better than that. It's not that early in the morning. Good morning, everyone. Good deal. All right. It's my pleasure as the chair of the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus to welcome you all to the third event of the Kentucky Black History Celebration. I am Representative George Brown, and I serve as the chairman of the caucus. We are pleased to present this speaker series in collaboration with the Kentucky Historical Society, who have graciously provided this magnificent facility for the staging of today's event. The Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus was formed to acknowledge and celebrate the continuing triumphs and inspiring contributions of a great people. It is that history which reflects strength, courage, and perseverance in the face of historic challenges. We know part of the history, but it is the part that we seek that strengthens and informs us all in a way that provides greater understanding, respect, and encouragement to build a better future. We encourage open discussion and free expression on topics that impact us all. We would like to thank each of you for joining us in today's program. It is my pleasure to introduce the Kentucky Democratic floor leader and vice of the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus, Senator Gerald Neal, who will give the purpose and moderate this discussion. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Scott Alvey to come and give a greetings on behalf of the Kentucky Historical Society, please.
Great. Thank you, Senator Neal. As Senator Neal mentioned, my name is Scott Alvey. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Kentucky Historical Society. And our mission here at the Historical Society is to educate and to engage the public through Kentucky history so that we might face the challenges of the future. And we do this in a multitude of ways. We are a library, we're a research center, most of you see us as a museum, but we're actually just a group that oversees all the treasures and the documents and the history of Kentucky. We've been very fortunate to be the keepers of Kentucky's legacy since 1836. I wanted to mention real briefly, while I have the podium, a couple of current programs that we are conducting here at the Historical Society. If you have a chance, I welcome you to go down to the Old State Capitol. We have up on display Through Sleet's Eyes, A Witness to History. It's a photography exhibit of a photojournalist from Owensboro, Kentucky, Mona Sleet Jr., who captured the images of the American Black experience using a style that reflects his artistic interpretation of the history which surrounded him. And we were just having a discussion a moment ago about we all need that ability to recognize where history that surrounds us so that we know how to help not only save it, but help to interpret it. And I think this exhibit would be a great example of how we can do that. That'll be on display through March of this month. We're also participating in the 60th anniversary of the March on Frankfort. March 2nd, we'll have a walking tour before King came to town, a resistance and oppression in Kentucky from 1830 to 1910, which is, I think, an important part. 1910 is when the Capitol moves from the old state capitol up to the current, I don't know why we continue to call it the new state capitol, it's just the state capitol, but from that time period. Following that will be a screening of Joanna Hayes' documentary produced, The Music, the March, the Movement, which chronicles 1964's March on Frankfort, which will be followed by a question and answer session. And we're currently also working with Eagle Scout William Bache to install an exhibition on the Wade-Baden Alliance. I think this might have been inspired by an NHD project, and yes, I'm getting an affirmative nod. And I know we also, not too long ago, dedicated a marker at the Wade-Baden Peace Park there in Louisville. So hope you have a chance to come by and visit us that. So although we gather here during Black History Month, we also have several opportunities throughout the year to celebrate Kentucky's African American history. And it includes some suggested resources you can kind of see on, if you can hit the next slide for us, up on our webpage for those that are learning to look throughout the year to learn more about Kentucky's African American history. It's often my role when I get up, and I don't want to take too much time because I really want to get to our panelists of speakers, to talk about, and the role that we play here at the Historical Society, is to tell the history of Kentucky. But seldom do I think people think about why history matters, or maybe better thought of what value is there in understanding history. And I know that can be a topic for a future panel, but I wanted to leave you with one aspect that I think would help lead us into today's conversation. History is not just facts. It's an interpretation of those facts. It's that laboratory that gives us a chance to investigate our human experience. And a friend reminded me this morning in an email, she says, you all are in the business of creating trust through memory. And I think that requires us to be more open to the broader spectrum of history that's out there, including the ones that we may not be familiar with. By understanding each other's histories, we build trust. And through trust, we build communities. So I'm very privileged that you chose to have us come here and bring your speaker series to us and share the story, share your all story. So thank you very much, Senator Neal.
Thank you, Scott. And let me tell you, this collaboration with the Kentucky Historical Society, with the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus, is very intentional. And you can just about see what that means, the context of what this is when we collaborate with such an organization. So we're very pleased and quite excited, quite frankly, for us to do this. And this is the second year of this collaboration, and we're looking forward to collaborations into the future. I also want to point out that although my friend is a little modest, we've had just great leadership from Representative George Brown of the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus. He's helped steer us in the right direction, kept us moving, motivating us, and every once in a while he gives me an opportunity to say 2 or 3 words, and I appreciate that. Let's give him a round of applause. He's done very well. Thank you. You know, advocates of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in higher education indicate that the diversity of a university's faculty, staff, and students influences its strength, productivity, and intellectual personality. That the diversity of experience, age, physical ability, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, and many other attributes contributes to the richness of the environment for teaching and research. A vast and growing body of research provides evidence that a diverse student body, faculty, and staff benefits the joint missions of teaching and research by increasing creativity, innovation, and problem solving. Yet, these initiatives have come under attack as divisive and threatening. Florida, Tennessee, other states, and now Kentucky have raised this question. Laws have been established and bills have been introduced, even in our state here and are pending. Many say that these bills and these actions compromise academic freedom in our colleges and universities, while representing a historical reaction that has manifested itself periodically. It raises a question: what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? And some would add belonging. What are its benefits? What is the basis of this reaction? What are its challenges notwithstanding? I'm delighted to say we have a panel of individuals that are not just knowledgeable, they're practitioners, they're individuals that have made a mark, they're authors, they're researchers, they're the type of educators that are comprehensive in their approach, and they have depth in their ability to reflect information that I think we will gain greatly from today. We have with us Dr. Aaron Thompson, who I'm going to call up in just a minute to start this out. And let me just give you a little bit of how we're going to proceed. What we're going to do is we're going to have Dr. Aaron Thompson give us a presentation that sort of puts us in the context of what we're talking about. He's an individual with tremendous background, and as you know, he's the head of the CPE, Council of Post-Secondary Education, and has a long career in the field. We also have Dr. John Harden, who's a historian. This is an individual that's renowned in his field, well respected across the whole breadth of educational thought and initiatives in this state and beyond. We have Dr. Kevin Cosby. Dr. Kevin Cosby is an individual that has a number of unique qualities that makes him very valuable to this particular panel. Not only is he an individual that is deep in bringing us the the spirituality from the pulpit, but he's deep academically and intellectually in the field, well studied, and is head of Simmons Colleges of Kentucky in Louisville, Kentucky, one of our 2 HBCUs. And we're fortunate to have, and I must make note, of Dr. Capo, who's the president of Kentucky State University, of which I am an alum, and very much appreciate the leadership that he's been providing at Kentucky State University. We have Dr. Anastasia Kerwood, University of Kentucky, a Harlem professor. I probably pronounced that wrong. Professor and department chair of history and director of the Commonwealth Institute for Black Studies of the University of Kentucky. And we have my good friend, and let me tell you, an individual that's taught me much, and that's Dr. Ricky Jones, an individual that inspires me. Every time I turn on or look at TV, or sometimes I turn on, I look at a Courier Journal where he's a columnist, he adds another layer of and depth of understanding. And I just love the way he probes into an issue to the point of being provocative, to stimulate your thinking, to challenge the status of the thinking or the mode of thinking many people have now. He makes us think. Appreciate that. We have a very distinguished, I challenge anyone to challenge what we have here today and what we will have to offer here today. Would you please give them all a round of applause? We're going to begin with Dr. Thompson. I'm going to ask him to come up and give his presentation, and I will thereafter moderate the panel, and we'll proceed accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Neal. Senator Brown, good to see you. Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus, thank you for inviting me and this distinguished group of people up here. I have to admit, I'm clearly the one that doesn't dress nearly as dapper as the rest of these folks, but I'll try to be as eloquent as they are. First of all, let me challenge you to think about exactly what this conversation is about. And I'll challenge you with the way possibly you think about it. And let me just ask you a question. Raise your hand. How many of you believe in diversity? Raise your hand. How many of you value it? How many of you can operationally define it? It gets tougher, though, as I go down the path, right? And the point I'm trying to make is if we don't know exactly what it is and how we do it, then we are called to a task of defending it someday by other people who define it maybe for us. And that's the point I want to be clear about in the way that we're at least doing business in Kentucky. We have defined it, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But first of all, I just want to start out with a conversation of something I can prove. And those of you who know me know I'm a researcher. I've been in this field a long time, almost 40 years, Dr. Acapo. And I've been doing the research on this from a standpoint of an empiricist, as well as someone who believes in the substantive aspects of what it brings to humanity. But I want to start out by saying clearly, education is the great equalizer, if you think about it. Personally, I value it substantively from the standpoint of an African American who was born in the hills of Clay County, Kentucky, to an illiterate sharecropper father and a mother had an 8th grade education. I went to a segregated school. That's the only choice I had. I couldn't go to the hospital because there was no hospitals for me when I was born, so mama had me at home. The idea that you can get from that place to being the first Kentuckian, the first Eastern Kentuckian, and the first African American to lead higher education in Kentucky can only be attributed to the process of good education and luck and maybe God's interference. But without a doubt, you have to think about what this is saying and what we're doing in Kentucky. A couple of points that I want to make before I leave it up to this great panel to take you down all kinds of roads is that we look at DEI in Kentucky from a higher education viewpoint, and I'll give you some numbers here in a second, but we look at it, and many of you have heard me say this before, so I'm repeating, that in higher education, we're like a big dance. And it's a dance that everybody should want to go to. We just have too few people in Kentucky that want to do it. So we somehow, as educators, lost the edge in helping them to understand that in order to have a life that fully they can engage with, they're going to need more education. But it's like a big dance that we invite people to. So diversity, we want all kinds of people from different aspects of the population to come to our dance. And since diversity is an aspect of the population, the way we think, the way we look, and so on, the culture we bring with us, we have to think that we are enhanced. And if any of you read a lot of research on this, as a matter of fact, please buy one of my books. I still have kids in college. But, you'll find out that the more we have diverse thought inside of higher education, the higher and the better the education. Let me be clear. We're not lower education, we're higher education. In order to be higher education, we have to be able to debate. We have to be able to look at all sides of the viewpoint and then come up with a decision on our own. That's what we do. We call it problem solving, we call it critical thinking, we call it creative output. And diversity of the populations inside that institution of students, faculty, and staff increases the likelihood that they'll learn more, because you'll learn more from people different than you than from people like you. But diversity goes a little bit farther, because if you look at truly, if we're arguing for what's good for the state of Kentucky, we're going to argue this standpoint. We want to see a Kentucky that is economically booming. We are having that now. We want to see one that employers want to come to us and stay with us, so what they tell us that matters more than even a tax base that they can live with is a highly educated workforce. And you can't have a highly educated workforce in their mind, because it is a global economy, unless we're producing people that can operate within that global economy. We may give them a credential, but if they're not prepared for it, employers are telling us, as they told me last week in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, the 5 big firms that moved there, saying, Thompson, we need a highly educated workforce that's diverse, and a lot of diversity was around that table, that knows how to get along with other people. But they also need all these soft skills. So diversity has an outcome that's good economically for Kentucky. And our employers are telling us that. That's why you have employers on our side talking about we need to be increasing the efforts, not decreasing. But let me go a little bit farther. Kentucky, we've been able to think about this and operationalize this in the way that we carry out our work, especially in public higher ed. We've been able to say that if we're getting a student, no matter where they're from, we need to be able to interact with them based on who they are, where they're from, and help them to get to a place where they need to go. So if diversity to the dance is a group of people thinking differently that we can learn from, then inclusion means that once we get them, we have to ask them to dance. We just can't sit aside and somehow have a particular directional influence, say, I'm going to talk to you, just 4 people in the front row that looks a lot like me and talks a lot like me, and you're going to get the better grades and get the better jobs. We have to say, we have to go to the back row sometimes, Reverend Cosby, you know that, and be able to say, how do we get you engaged in this academic, social, emotional, cultural endeavor to get you what you need in order for you to be successful for you and your family? So that's what inclusion is. That's our operational definition that we've been able to put in Kentucky from the CPE policies, from our standpoint of our strategic agenda, and also performance funding. But we also have to look at, demographically, we have to look at the numbers that we get coming in, and many of our students, let's get real, let's be honest, we have many students coming in and out of high school that have not been given all the opportunities they need to compete. It's our job in higher education not to blame K-12, but to get them and give them that. So if inclusion then is asking everybody to dance, and by the way, I've seen Representative Brown dance. He's not nearly as good as I am. It's important for me that we give them the kind of experiences, the knowledge, the inputs, whether it's academic, social, emotional, mental, whatever the case may be, in order so they can dance. So he can dance as equally as I can. So those inputs directly is equity. Let's not be scared of that word. Equity are given those things that they are allowed to have in order to experience, not giving anything as far as outcomes. And my argument is, if you give me the opportunity, I will live up to it and I'll win. But it's our job in higher education to provide that. So we have to make clear that directional and reciprocal relationship between a healthy workforce that's diverse and the outcomes that we want. Because if we don't, you're going to spend more of your taxes in places you'd rather not spend more of your taxes in. You can devote more money to building prisons if you choose to. You can devote more money to Medicaid. But we found out that if you're highly educated, guess what? You have less of a chance being involved with either one of those, and we'd be able to play. So as we set up this conversation, I want you to understand that there is a pragmatic element to this. Yes, I am clearly an African American in this state arguing for more equality and more equity, no doubt. But I'm also an academician saying that we have to do this. I'm a leader. And I want to give you what we've done since we've operationalized this into what's going on. Our biggest focus in higher education since I've taken over higher education is to close gaps. And it's not to close gaps from the standpoint we bring those that are highly performing, bring them down and so we can close it that way. It's to take us all to where we need to go. You've heard of being 60% attainment of all Kentucky citizens by 2030. That just didn't pop out of the air. That is a statistically predicted model that we've been able to build prescriptive policies around. So what have we done since then? Just give you an example. Our retention rates in our two-year colleges among our underrepresented minorities are up 13.5%. Our four-year URM up 8.5%. Our graduate rate in 2 years among URM is up 18.4%, 4-year 12.4%. We're at 55% overall attainment in Kentucky now. We could not have gotten there without helping those that needed the help the most. The only population that we have been up over the last 6 years in an increase has been that of the underrepresented populations. Demographics, people say, are changing. Well, they have changed, and they are going to be changing even more. Our job is to meet them where they're at to get where we need to go. So my pragmatic item, people say, well, I hear you, you're really arguing for something you believe in. I believe in it, not just because I believe in it. I believe in it because I can show you the data to back it up. So when we get into this conversation today, we'll all have different perspectives on it. I have other perspectives too. I'm a sociologist, you know I do. But the item that I want you to remember is that if we are taking steps to take us backwards, then we're taking steps to take Kentucky backwards. We cannot look at it in a bifurcated way. We have to look at it in a holistic way. With that, Senator Neal, I will turn it back over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. So, and yet, despite what you said here, we have challenges in this particular effort. I'm going to ask Dr. Harden, Dr. Harden, put this in a historical context. So how did we arrive here? Take us back, bring us forward. How did we arrive here?
There we go. Now, we arrived as a state, as a commonwealth in 1792 that limited what people of African descent, Native American descent, aliens could do. A while back, I had a chance to review some of the laws for the Commonwealth, and it's sort of amazing. If you were not European, you couldn't do a lot. I mentioned on February 1st that there were all kinds of things that were separate. And we've evolved. We've closed our separate orphanages for race, schools for the deaf, schools that were designed to take care of only blacks. State law. If you want to have an interesting challenge and path, read the acts of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It's a little scary at one point. The good point about reading the past, about knowing all of the segregated, in this particular city, by the way, many of these facilities were here in Frankfurt. The evolutionary process as the Commonwealth reacted to segregated higher education with the Day Law in 1904, which required places to be separate. In my own studies, and people across the country don't realize that Kentucky was an interesting place as the 15th state in the Union. It took on the whole business of keeping people who were different apart for a long time. If you were an alien, if you were black, if you were Native American, and that's another issue. I know there are some folks in the Native American Heritage Commission who deal with that issue. So consequently, what has happened over the long period, and I'm keeping my limit to 3 to 5 minutes, we go through a period where Kentuckians have to react to the various amendments to the Constitution, 13th Amendment to the Constitution ending slavery, which we only ratified in 1976. It was ratified by everybody else in when? 1865. And so there is this sense of we like the past, we like all the benefits of the past, but we don't want to change very quickly. And so we eventually go through the 13th Amendment, later on, the 14th, the 15th. We eventually recognize that women can vote in Kentucky. Blacks could vote in Kentucky. We've elected people. One of the things about your history, African Americans were voting in Kentucky, unlike other southern states. We were electing people in smaller offices in various parts of the state. Louisville, for example, had elected officials, but they didn't do much because they were restricted by laws. The interesting piece to this process, even in 1935, Anderson-Mayer Act, this was a particular law that allowed blacks in the state of Kentucky to go to other states to get graduate education. One of my alma maters is University of Michigan. A number of people went there to get their education because they were not allowed to go to the University of Kentucky. All right? So what do? We had faith. Lyman Johnson, 1949. He decides to challenge the University of Kentucky. When one student in 1940 tried to enter, it took him 5 years to be told. His name was Charles Eubanks, by the way. And he was kicked out. He said, no, you cannot go to University of Kentucky because you're black. And they said it in writing. But Lyman Johnson challenged it once again, and he was able to enter, to take classes in 1949, 5 years before Brown versus Board of Education. So bit by bit, Kentucky was opening its doors to diverse populations in its educational institutions, but ever so slowly. It was more like a bad crack. You sort of get a little light. Fast forward. Brown versus Board of Education, 5 cases, none of those in Kentucky. They were in other states. 1960, there's Brown. It opens up across the country. 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. 1966, what happens in Kentucky? Governor Ned Breathitt, he decides to sign a Civil Rights Act, the first state in the South to do that. Okay? Very positive. Georgia Powers Davis. Anyone recognize that name? She worked on fair housing, trying to open up all these things. What does that mean? Fair housing means people of all races could get equal treatment under the law. We also had a, Human Rights Commission, all of these things, helping us to, in a sense, have that diversity, to have that equity, to have that inclusion. All of these are positive things in the state. Finally, In the 1970s, we have affirmative action. Very positive steps moving forward, and that's a national phenomenon, and it's all good. It impacts every state, but it's all part of the process of helping what I think Dr. Thompson was talking about, people having that opportunity to engage in receiving the kinds of opportunities for success. It's one thing to get a degree. It's another thing to use it. Personally, I grew up in a segregated school in Louisville in the 1950s. I remember riding segregated railroad coaches out of Louisville's Union Station. Giant, bigger than this room for white citizens. This corner where these gentlemen are situated, black people would have to sit there, having to ride in the last coach of the train. That's a personal experience. I understand that transition. It's a good thing that Kentucky has moved beyond that past, and we're here in 2024 dealing with other issues. History is not dead people. History is change over time. What happened then has an impact on what's happening now. And so what we're dealing with in diversity is history reflecting change over time, taking all of these items, being diverse in who we are today, those living in that diverse atmosphere, taking advantage of it, and then including drawing the circle, whether you're a woman, a male, black, white, immigrant. All of these things historically have to be put in context. And as a historian, what I have to do is take all of this, and I'm watching my time, to look at history as something that's still alive. It's not dead. It's changing. And my job I retired in 2018 after 44 years of teaching at Western, UK, U of L, Kentucky State for 10 years. I said, now it's time for all of the young people to take my place. It's time for those of us who've been senior to give it to the juniors and say, make diversity happen for the next generation. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harden. So we have two individuals here, Dr. Kerwood and Dr. Jones, who literally, Dr. Jones was over the Pan-African Studies program in Louisville. You can articulate it better than I can, of course, and Dr. Kerwood at the University of Kentucky. I'm going to begin with Dr. Kerwood, but I want both of you to reflect on what Dr. Harden has said, and from your perspective, we are here. How did we get here from there? Where are we, indeed?
Thank you, Senator Neal. I believe you hold Senator Powers' seat, is that right?
Yes, I do. I succeeded Senator Powers, a great woman, great legislator.
So how did we get here? The way that I see diversity, equity, inclusion, those three legs that Dr. Thompson told us about, is as a tool in ongoing work, centuries long, you could say, but certainly of the last several decades, since 1968, to expand American democracy for everyone. I'm a historian. I like to begin with a story from the past, and so this is the story I'm going to tell you. In 1965, some historians, lawyers, constitutional lawyers, political scientists argue that's when America became a democracy, an electoral democracy, because of the Voting Rights Act. Up until that point, there was a feudal system in many, many parts of this nation. And in 1968, the first black congresswoman was elected to the U.S. Congress. That was Shirley Chisholm. There's a movie coming out about her next month, I believe. And then in 1972, she would run for president. So I'm going to tell you a story about Shirley Chisholm because I think she makes concrete what happened after 1968. She's coming of age politically in that era. And she had a challenge because the civil rights movement, which if you think about 1965 being the birth of a real electoral democracy in this country, think about the civil rights movement as a pro-democracy movement. So on the heels of that movement, Chisholm is looking at a world that has, in large part, made illegal the most egregious segregation, so no more of those segregated waiting rooms, and has built voting rights, or at least lack of impediment to voting rights, so less of the worst voter suppression that we had. Still, there's poverty, which is an important part of Jim Crow, and still there's some violence. So she comes to Congress in this instance. Sometimes it's easy to see Chisholm as maybe too niche of a story. I mean, she's so specific. She's a black woman. How is her story relevant to all Americans? You know, we're dividing people too much, right? You know, it's her story is not universal enough. I actually see things as the opposite. I see her story as incredibly universal because she was using this concept that is very much in the news these days, intersectionality. She was using that concept before it had that name. And many using the name these days do not understand the concept. So the concept that she was enacting was starting with everyone's humanity. You start with everybody being fully human and deserving full citizenship. So you start there. Then you recognize the specificities of everybody's experiences and challenges. And the people who were closest to her, obviously she was a black woman, so she had a lot of significance for black voters and black people. She was a woman, so she had a lot of significance for women across the color line, across all sorts of lines. But also poor people. She represented Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. It's a poor neighborhood. Also young people, especially in 1968, young people felt like she was in some ways the best candidate for Congress, and then in 72 for president, who was speaking for them, for their concerns. She also spoke on behalf, in some cases, of the environment and of LGBTQ folks. So she recognized all of these people as coming from their particular experiences, because of course we're all human, but we all have our own experiences. And then she also recognized where everybody could come together, where the intersections were within their concerns. In other words, she's using coalition. She's using coalition to push for expanding economic and political full American citizenship. So what she can bring to us is the both and. The both recognizing everyone's humanity and recognizing the particularity of experiences, especially of people who have not historically held the power. You can keep both of those points in mind so that we can come together. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are the inheritors of that legacy. It's about all of those concepts, and that set of concepts together are about enlarging our communities to recognize the voices, the input, the strengths of everybody.
So just a brief follow-up on that. So that diversity, describe that. Be specific about that. What manifests that diversity?
So diversity now is a shorthand for people who do not belong to the historically powerful group. So in these days, it oftentimes, it's coded black for many. Whereas the term diversity, of course, is much broader. It means difference within a certain body. The difference does not have to be scary. But it simply means, in the parlance that we're using it in diversity, equity, and inclusion, it simply means bringing in folks who have not historically had power. And these are black people, brown people, Native, indigenous, disabled, LGBTQ. The list is long. But what everybody shares is a lack of access to full humanity. Is that answering your question?
I think that's a good start.
Okay.
Dr. Jones, elaborate on that, your perspective on that, and from your perspective, where are we with respect to that? Like right now, we got a hint of where we came from. We know that journey fairly well, but where are we in the discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
All right, I will certainly try to limit that to Kentucky, but before I begin, you know, in this age of social media, you see people post all the time saying, I'm grateful for this, I'm humbled for this, I'm honored to do that, and quite often they're pretty empty, but I want to acknowledge the people that I'm up here with today. It is a great pleasure to be here with Brother Thompson, a Kentucky native who is really laboring in the vineyard, and we've shared emails, but today's the first day we've actually met personally, but I've observed him, you know, in media, and I always ask myself, how can this brother stay so calm? I think he's secretly a Rastafarian like Bob Marley and is smoking a lot of weed to keep his blood pressure down. I'm not sure if weed is legal in this state yet, so kudos to you, Brother Thompson, for, you know, a very, very important fight. To Dr. Kerwood, who is laboring in the vineyard at the University of Kentucky, which is one of my alma maters, and we'll talk about that a little bit in answering his question. You know, she's been involved in Africana studies. She is a trained historian. She is incredible. She's a great equestrian, which we didn't talk about. So, you know, black people do more than dance a little jig, sing a little song, and play a little ball. We ride horses as well, and you know about sisters like Shirley Chisholm, who said she was unbought and unbossed. I'm proud to call her a colleague and will do whatever I can to help her because, you know, contrary to popular belief, the University of Kentucky is not the most progressive place in the world either, even in 2024, and she's among a small cadre trying to push it forward. To Dr. Harden, a master historian and been at this game a very, very long time, and I think did a great job of contextualizing exactly where Kentucky sits, you know, on the landscape of history. You know, listen to him, value him while you have him. And finally, to my dear brother, Reverend Dr. Kevin Cosby. Reverend Dr. Kevin Cosby, not just a doctor of divinity, but also a PhD. He is actually my pastor who has benefited me so much spiritually, professionally, and personally. You know, I think he stands in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. You run into a lot of preachers who know a whole lot about one book, being the Bible, but they're not very well read in other things. You can talk history, sociology, philosophy, politics with this man, and he's equally strong in all those areas. You know, he often tells me that I should have been a preacher, and I tell him that he should have been a teacher. And the reality of it is this: every good preacher got a little bit of teacher in him, and every good teacher got a little bit of preacher in him. That's the way it is. So if you attend his church, you go to these sermons, they're really instructive, and they certainly speak about, you know, the struggles of our people, both past, present, and our possibilities. I love him to death. Whenever I'm not on the road, you know, I'm in church listening to him, and it's fabulous. I don't go just for the singing, as a lot of people do. The sermons are fabulous, so I love you, brother. So with all that said, because I know academics like to talk a lot. When I talked to Brother Neil, I was like, man, you've lost your mind putting 5, you know, academics on the same panel. We're going to be there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But where are we in Kentucky? I think that we have to be very, very serious and honest with ourselves about how far we've come and how far we have not. And I am a political scientist, okay? So all of my work really professionally is concerned with 2 things: politics and power. And Dr. Kerwood brought those up. And when I talk about politics, I'm not just talking about going to the booth and voting. It's this old Harold Laswell definition that says politics is the process that decides who gets what, when, where, and how. Politics is the process that decides who gets what, when, where, and how. Whenever we've moved forward politically to gain power, that is a people's collective ability to define their own reality and garner these assets even when others oppose them. That's power. If you want to do something and you can't do it because somebody else stops you from doing it, you do not have power. If you want to do something and you have to ask someone else for their approval for it to be greenlit, you do not have power. You may have individual influence, but you don't have power. And I think that we have all too many black folk, quite frankly, who have become drunk with being grateful and honored and humbled by having individual positions, but not worrying about collective power. I'm not a native Kentuckian. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I attended the U.S. Naval Academy, but most importantly, I attended Morehouse College, which helped to ground me on the idea of black power. I also lived it. Okay, I grew up in a city that's had a black mayor since 1974. My Morehouse brother, Maynard Jackson, was elected in 73, took office in 74. So for 50 years, we've had a black mayor in Atlanta. All of them haven't been good. And I always have to tell this story and put it in context. All of them have not been good. One of them even went to prison. But even in the face of that, we understood no matter if a mayor was successful or an abject failure, another black person was going to have an opportunity. In a place like Kentucky, an incredible burden, you know, an Anna Julia Cooper type burden is placed on every black person who rises to any position, because they know if they're conscious that if they fail, the door will be slammed on people who look like them for the foreseeable future. Even more disturbingly, some people, as Carter G. Woodson, our dear brother Carter G. Woodson said, it is Black History Month, and rarely do people mention Carter G. Woodson. Very few people are conversant about our brother Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson was the founder of Negro History Week, became Negro History Month, and now Black History Month. Second black person to get a PhD from Harvard after W.E.B. Du Bois. And in 1933, wrote a book that still relates to today, Miseducation of the Negro. And in a fabulous passage, he said, if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. So there are certainly some black people where their socialization and their education has warped their thinking in such a way that if they get one of these positions, well, they don't need white people to close the door behind them. They close the door on people who look like them moving forward. We see that. So in the anti-diversity movement in Kentucky, first of all, I think the conversation is wrong. It's really not about anti-DEI. The acronyms change over time. A few years ago, it was BLM, Black Lives Matter. Then it became CRT, critical race theory, even though none of these people had read Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw or anybody else. I don't think they've read much. I mean, we have a legislator in this state who literally made the argument a few weeks ago before a branch of the NAACP that her father was a white slave in the mid-20th century. That's not a joke. So if somebody is making a ridiculous argument like that, I am sure they've never read Carter G. Woodson, they've never read Bell, they've never read Crenshaw, they've never read Chisholm, they've never read anything else. I doubt if they've read a newspaper. And that's real to me. So it's not about CRT, and now the new boogeyman is DEI. It's not about any of these things. What we're really talking about is the maintenance of white supremacy in Kentucky. And people are loath to use that term because they're afraid of legislators like Representative Decker and others who are pushing these anti-black bills and laws, because that's what they are. When you talk about veterans or our Jewish brothers and sisters or the physically disabled, they're just cannon fodder. They'll be sacrificial lambs. They'll be, what do they call it, in collateral damage to these people attacking black folk as much as possible in the state of Kentucky. And when I say white supremacy, I repeat myself on this a lot because I didn't have a decent conceptualization of white supremacy earlier in my career. I thought it was just the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses on people's lawns, or white nationalists marching through Charlottesville saying Jews would not replace us and all that. That's not white supremacy. Again, you see those people coming from a mile away. White supremacy is much more sophisticated than that. What white supremacy really is a single group of people who believe, because of the color of their skin, because they are white, they ultimately have the right to know, think, and decide about everything of import. They feel that they have the right to know what the problems are. They have a right to think about what the options to speak to those problems are. Sure, they'll form committees and things of that nature and say, well, you can advise us, we'll take your recommendations under advisement, but ultimately, in the end, they then get to decide what to do and what not to do. That's power. So when you talk about diversity in Kentucky, I don't know what these people are so afraid of. White people are winning in Kentucky and winning decisively. Kentucky is over 87% white. It is the 8th whitest state in the Union currently. That's the data. Now, I must say it's doing better because in 2023, it was the 7th whitest state in the Union, and it's now switched places with Oregon, so I guess that's something for Kentucky to celebrate. Kentucky has never had a black governor. It's never had a black United States senator. It's never had a black person in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's had very few black statewide elected officials. The very first one was Daniel Cameron, and it is arguable whether or not he's black. In the city of Louisville, where I live, the most diverse city in the state of Kentucky, Louisville is one of only 2 of the 50 largest cities in the country to never have elected a black, Hispanic, or female mayor. The major universities in this state have never had a black president. To my knowledge, they haven't had black provosts outside of the HBCUs, and we'll get to that. As sports obsessed as this state is, you've never even had a black athletic director, even though the high revenue sports that produce millions upon millions of dollars for these schools are primarily populated by black male students. So what's this state so afraid of? You're losing, and you're getting worse. It's an environment that is legislatively hostile, and it is getting to the point where talented black students and black professionals will not come here. And talented black students and professionals who are here will not stay, including your natives. So as Brother Thompson brought up, if you can't argue on moral grounds with folks who James Baldwin would characterize as moral monsters, then do it on monetary grounds. So even when you talk about education, when you talk about faculty, the University of Louisville, for instance, claims to be the leading metropolitan university in the state and is very committed to diversity. I've been there for 28 years, and let me tell you, that is a lie. As I was getting ready to exit the chairmanship in Pan-African Studies, I'm no longer the chair now, that bio is a little bit old. In the College of Arts and Sciences, which is the largest college at the University of Louisville, we started a school year a few years ago with 24 full-time black faculty members. Don't look at the numbers of the PTLs, the part-time lecturers, right? As my grandmother used to say, those are catch-out workers. I'm talking about your professors of the line, the tenured professors, the associates, the assistants, associates, and fulls. There were 24 blacks out of over 400 professors. During the school year, 6 of those black professors left. We finished with 18 black professors. 9 of them, that is 50%, were in the Black Studies department, Pan-African Studies. So how is that very diverse? And the current president, who was hired because of her track record with diversity, because the university refused to hire a black president at the University of Louisville, we can't have that. There was a big hullabaloo even about having a black basketball coach who people are chomping at the bit to fire, and were chomping at the bit to fire him the day after he got hired.
Okay, we're gonna want to come back. Excuse me just a second.
Well, I'm almost finished.
No, I'm getting ready to say wrap it up because I want to get to,
No, most definitely. The state's jacked up.
well said. Go ahead. Dr. Cosby, would you please, in the framework that you're hearing from one end to the other, by the way, you in the position as the president of a HBCU, what do you see as the value then in diversity, equity, and inclusion in this state?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate with these outstanding scholars. I feel much like the man who put his mule in the Kentucky Derby, and they asked the farmer, well, do you think your mule's going to win? And he said, no, but I thought that the influence would do him good. So this influence, being around these brilliant scholars, is doing me well. The opening statement by my brother here about history is so important. Why do we study history? I mean, you cannot go to Starbucks and say to the proprietor at Starbucks that I know that the Civil War began in 1861 and ended in April of 1865, and they'll give you a free cup of coffee. So therefore, since there is no cash register, quote unquote, monetary value in studying history, what is the value of history? I would submit to you that history is valuable because, first of all, through history, we get inspired by its accomplishments. Whenever I study history as the president of an HBCU, and I feel melancholy because of the challenges that I'm facing as the president of an HBCU, I just have to reflect upon William J. Simmons, for whom our school is named, who was a runaway slave in South Carolina, and the challenges that he faced as the president post-Reconstruction. So you get inspired by his accomplishments. Secondly, you study history because you learn the lessons of history. History teaches us important lessons. Also, you study history in order to correct its malfeasance. The second point, why do we study history? To learn its lessons. And I think this is the lesson that I learned from history in the United States and also the history of Kentucky. And that is what Derek Bell, quote unquote, father of critical race theory, attempted to tell us. CRT, I don't know what that means to you, critical race theory, but CRT means to me Caucasians rejecting truth. That's what CRT fundamentally is, Caucasians rejecting truth. And this is what Derek Bell told us. He said that racism is permanent. He said there will be, quote unquote, peaks of progress, periods of success in which white supremacies, Dr. Jones talked about, will begin to reassert itself. And that is one of the primary lessons of history, that whenever there has been, quote unquote, minimal progress for blacks in this country, there's always been what Dr. King talked about, the white backlash. So if you have the close of the Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of Reconstruction, soon after that, you're going to have Tilden and Hayes Compromise, in which Hayes is a Republican, is going to reunite the country, reunite the Confederates with the Union troops. If you have a series of political advances for blacks from 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, 68 fair housing laws, instead of listening to the report of the Kerner Commission that came out in March of 1968, that same year when the Kerner Commission, Otto Kerner, and even our Secretary of State, Peyton, a woman, said we are two societies, separate and unequal. The Kerner report said that white America has created the problems in black America. White America sustains the ghetto, created the ghetto, sustains the ghetto. And what do? We elect Nixon. Elect him twice. You have Obama, and then you have the white backlash. You have Trump. You have the protest of 2020 with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in 2020, in which on the New York Times bestseller list, you have all of these books like White Fragility or the 1619 Project. And then the next year, white supremacy starts to reassert itself with an attack on critical race theory. So if the thesis of Derek Bell is correct, racism is permanent. And that's why it seems that every major leader that I can think of, who I respect, became Afro-pessimistic at the close of their lives. So Frederick Douglass, who dies in 1895, he's pessimistic. He's replaced by Booker T. Here comes Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. You read Dr. King is pessimistic. W.E. Du Bois says, I'm out of here, I'm going to Ghana. It seems like that racism is permanent. Derek Bell says we still must fight. We still must be resilient. We still must be resistant. I will say this. I think that one of the mistakes we make with diversity, equity, and inclusion is that we have not defined who gets included. Because to a certain extent, diversity, equity, and inclusion meant the co-optation of the black professional class away from the black masses. So we went from segregation to desegregation to integration to the disintegration of the black poor. What we should have gone to was the segregation, desegregation, reparations, reconciliation. This is more of a biblical concept as a preacher. So I don't know, when you say diversity, as a president of an HBCU, diversity is not on my agenda, because my school is 99% black and my faculty is truly a diverse faculty. So I don't have to deal with diversity, equity, inclusion. What I want diverse and more equitableness is in, equity is in the allocation of resources. To me, we've engaged in symbolism. Should Harriet Tubman replace Jackson on the $20 bill? Symbolism, holidays, Juneteenth, images, blacks and whites in diverse situations, and tokens, blacks in position without power, status without strength. Symbolism, Holidays, Images, and Tokens, which happens to be an acronym. Symbolism, symbols, H, holiday, I, images, T, tokens.
So Dr. Kerwood, you've heard a perspective from the head of a HBCU, an institution that's rooted and developed from Black experience, that's now manifesting itself in educating individuals now, and the perspective of Dr. Cosby, correct me if I'm wrong, is that that's not on his agenda because he's looking for the, I would say, diversity of outcomes, perhaps. Those are my words. What, from the University of Kentucky, the flagship University of Kentucky, which is certainly not an HBCU, what would be your response, or what would be your perspective as it relates to the need and value of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative and those kinds of programs in those types of institutions?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. And what I think I hear the Reverend Dr. Cosby saying is that diversity in itself is not sufficient if we really are to enact the expansion of democracy that people engaged in the Black freedom struggle have been working on for years, centuries. Diversity in itself is something that predominantly white institutions do need to recognize, because with the history of power that has resided at the university, people have been excluded. When you take an institution that's historically an HBCU that has been, despite the inclusion, empowering those folks who have been excluded, then we have a different situation. And then what you move to is equity. And I think that's the argument that Dr. Cosby is making. It's the allocation and a reallocation of scarce resources. We don't have endless resources. I mean, there are certain things in this world that are endless. Resources, especially money, are not one of them. And so I'm actually really glad that you brought up Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass loved to say, and Shirley Chisholm loved to quote him, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." And it's true that what we are asking for is a greater share of the power and the resources. That's absolutely true. And I can understand why that would make some people nervous, especially if they hold ill-gotten gains. But the vision that I have, and I take my cue from people like Shirley Chisholm, is a democratic sharing of resources in a fair way so that nobody monopolizes and nobody loses out.
So Dr. Thompson, you've heard a range of responses and perspectives here, particularly in the context of DEI and broader. In other words, DEI doesn't exist on an island. It didn't just pop into existence. It has a history, has a context, has dynamics. Would you reflect or give your perspective upon what you've heard? And then what we're going to do is we're going to have more of a free-flowing discussion back and forth among the panelists.
Thank you. First of all, listening to these fine people up here makes me want to be a professor again. Laying out, I'm going to say three things about what I've heard, then I have one other item to add. I think Professor Jones is absolutely right. We've got a long way to go period. When I look at where we're at, I look at the universities I represent. What he said is absolutely true. So what do you do then, number two, if you have a positional power scenario, as I do to some degree? You know, I'm not the president of the universities, I'm the head of CPE, which represents the needs of the state with higher ed. And when I see that and say that, what am I doing in my position? If not me, whom, right, is the way I state it. Well, some of the things that we've done, such as started ALDI, which is a group that brings in about 40 people of color every year to build them into a positional power situation, to build out some of those. That's the power that I have. I have the power to look at when I can get resources that I can get it to the people that can do it, right? The third thing, and I never disagree with Reverend Cosby, he's smarter than I am. The one thing I would say, though, even in HBCU, for us to assume that black folk know about black history is a bad assumption, right?
Amen.
So my argument is there is a need to have that debate there, too. Because if we're going to build power,
That's right.
we're going to have to build a critical mass. We have a lot of people in the choir, and this is an academic word I'm getting ready to use, but we suck at singing. The idea that, number three, then, the position I'm in, I have to look at how to build a critical mass that looks at what's good for Kentucky. Now, the item that I'll add simply is this. We come from this from different viewpoints, no doubt. I'm a sociologist, and I haven't gone in great detail there, but I can tell you that the only way we have a voice is to be able to be in a position to have a voice, but we have to do something with the voice. As a professor, my voice was a little bit different than it is as the head of higher education, but the voice that I have is one that sometimes I have to whisper, and sometimes, by the way, Professor Jones, if you knew me personally, you know exactly who I am, as some people know, because I'm not quiet. What I am, though, I'm strategic, or I try to be, to build up what we need to build up in this state in order to get where we need to go. We're going to have to be able to put people in a position whereby they have a voice, is the way I see it. The other item I'll add, Senator Neal, and I could go in just great detail here. In Kentucky, we've been able to operationally define, and we've been having rocks thrown at us because we haven't been so inclusive of everybody. I would love to do that because it's all diversity, but you've got to be in a position where you are able to build the choir, to be able to build what's needed to be built to get where we're going. Kentucky, of all the states we've mentioned, has actually come farther from our base than the other states that's been mentioned that's gone down this path. However, we are in a position, though, if we're not careful, we go back to Professor Jones once again and saying that if we're not careful, we'll be saying the same thing 20 years from now, whether it's CRT, whether it's DEI, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's BLM. All of those things will have been, if we don't have a big enough choir to tell people what they really are. I bet I'm one of the few people in this state that's ever taught CRT. And so far, I haven't heard anybody define what I taught yet. You know, the idea, though, Senator Neal, that it is working with folk like you all who are in the legislative bodies or governor's offices and our campuses to talk about what it means. We often say, and the reason why I started the conversation off earlier with everybody, we all say we value diversity. When we operationalize it, put resources where it needs to be put, have the kinds of conversations that we need to have, that's when you get to be able to say, then do you really value it? And the conversation that we're having right now, whether it's anti-DEI or not, I don't even look at it that way. But I think it's a needed conversation that we are now called to have, that we should have been having all along, in a way that goes to build that critical mass. And what really scares me is that whatever passes or not passes, this should not be a conversation we let die simply because we got through one point in time. And that, to me, is much more of what I'm called to do in the position I'm in, I think, more than any other item. But we're going to have to, I said I was going to stop, but one other thing. We're going to have to build, we talk about role models, I can give you a whole dissertation on this. If we are looking around our faculty and our staff and our administrators in higher education now, we're having role models drop off like crazy. And that's not all purely because of any bills that's been proposed. And I would offer us up to this scrutiny. What are we doing within our world to build what we need to build with the power that we need to have, or have we acquiesced, right? Have we done the queen bee syndrome, or have we sold everything that belongs to us personally and professionally to go to a place that we can feel comfortable? I'm an old guy, and I hope I never get to that point.
Dr. Harden, have you heard all of this? We started off with you, the historical context. We've heard I will interpret it this way. The perspective of the brutal truth coming out of our past, arriving where we are, making reference to various stages of history, Dr. Cosby, that reflect how we got to where we are now. The question being raised, and I hear a little anguish in this discussion, which is expected. Where do we go from here? What does this mean to where we are? What is the obligation of those who have the reins of power? What is the goodwill that can be developed, or is it out the door?
Well, first of all, you just mentioned the title of Martin Luther King's book, one of his books. Where do we go from here, from chaos to community? It's a sense of failing to understand where we've been, and it's sort of like deja vu all over again. I kept thinking about some of the things that's being said, and in my sort of mind, I'm thinking the 19th century, Tilden, Hayes, Compromise, and we went through that already. We don't really understand our past very well. Correct. We understand what's good. We want to celebrate the Kentucky Derby, but we don't want to remember that the first black jockeys on the Kentucky Derby horses. And when we think about my old Kentucky home, I always have this story about my dad wanted to go to the Kentucky Derby. He was given tickets. And when the person at the gate said, "Oh, where'd you get these tickets?" he tore them up. And from that point, he said, "I'm not going to the Derby. Mm-hmm. It does not reflect me. Come on, man. It reflects somebody else." So listening to all of this, it seems like there is a failure to historically communicate where we've been, where we are now, and where we want to go in the future. Before this, I was sort of working on some questions about DEI, CRT, and I've read the 1619 Project. In our community, we had a community discussion on that. And it took a lot just for the community to understand the 1619 Project. And if you read it carefully, it's an interesting compilation of different scholars addressing some of these same issues that were discussed by Carter G. Woodson, who went to Berea, Kentucky person. All right. We've been down this path so many times. We've beaten the dead horse, and as soon as we've beaten him, we drag him out, we beat him again. That horse is dead. Well, why are we beating him again? Well, we have nothing else to do. It's politically appropriate to beat the dead horse again. We want to say, well, we've got racial issues. Well, okay, well, let's get over this and go to the next point. HBCUs. I'm an HBCU graduate as well as what's called a Pee-wee, predominantly white institution. I love my HBCU, Fisk University. All right? Morehouse, Kentucky State. What those institutions have done and are doing is to constantly remind those who go there, white, black, and Asian folk, that there is a history in America of how different groups of people had to accomplish things under very difficult circumstances. My HBCU experience made me a much better person. It helped me to understand having this in my skin helped me to survive. And white students who go there suddenly realize something. We didn't know this. I try to encourage people, if you get one semester at an HBCU, it will pay for yourself and pay you and your family in many ways you don't realize. So I'm listening to all of these things. It's sort of like we're, again, beating something that historically has already been stated. A group of us 150 people in Kentucky got together a few years ago and $500,000 to create the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia. My other editors are not here today. We tried to tell people all of these experiences of what happened in Kentucky. The same things we've been talking about, they've already been said. That book is now in 1,000 libraries around the world. It tells the story of how Kentucky accomplished or did not accomplish what it said it was going to do in 1792. You got to go back to the beginning of the Commonwealth, look at all the constitutions which prohibited blacks and whites, men and women from doing certain things. You look at the history, and then look at how African Americans, Native Americans, and others survived the process. All of these statements are very useful. Now what we have to do is say, okay, DEI is simply something that's already been addressed. No, it hasn't. It's been stated, but not resolved. No one mentioned the Kentucky plan. A few years ago, that was the big deal. Does anyone know what the Kentucky plan is? We've forgotten about it, right? If I was to mention, a few years ago, if I said Kentucky plan, shh, don't talk about that. How do we desegregate? Well, we've done that. Now we go to the next thing. There will be something else after DEI, and I agree. It's a work in progress. History is change over time. Well, resolution of events is change over time. And I see entering the room one of my favorite students, and I want to give him some props. Derek, good to see you.
So let me do this. So this has been framed, this discussion has been framed around race.
Right.
But DEI is about more than race.
Correct.
How does this, and we know, I think we framed why it's
Right.
framed as race. How does this inform or impact or give us insight or benefits that which is defined as diversity other than race?
I would simply say it's something that if Kentucky is going to be a worldwide leader, and I appreciate the governor saying we're going to be the worldwide leader on EV equipment, but we have to be worldwide leaders on everything. If we have to present the Commonwealth as a great state, it has to be willing to accept a lot more and be willing to adapt and deal with its current issues so that we don't have to keep repeating them over and over. George Santayana said, those who fail to understand the past are what?
Doomed to repeat.
Condemned to repeat them.
Dr. Jones, your perspective. We've come from a very pointed perspective articulated by you all the way back to the reality of engaging, going forward. Do we stop here? These are my words. Do we engage? Where do we go from here?
I'll try to be succinct and talk about the things that trouble me in this. The first thing is I think Kentuckians really need to be honest and deal with the racial culture that's been established in this state. I never heard the term polite racism before I moved here. And I've grown to understand what it is. I'm always fascinated by how vociferous and aggressive members of the anti-black crew are from the other side, and how people on our side edit themselves and are quite often, very, very measured in their responses. I don't think that really works. I do believe that a renewed revolutionary spirit has to take hold where you have much stronger direct voices. And we know, as Reverend Cosby and I talk kind of off the grid about this, all progress for black people in this country, and I always talk about race, you know, people move us away from it in conversations quite often. I always stick with it because I think all the other struggles in this discussion are really tributaries from black struggle. And Reverend Cosby and I talk about how every bit of progress that's been made for black people in this country has been created by black revolutionaries, all of them. Tubman, revolutionary. Douglass, revolutionary. You know, Carter G. Woodson, black revolutionary. Du Bois, revolutionary. King, revolutionary. X, revolutionary. And then the seats that those people create are quite often occupied by more passive people, and that opens the door for things to slide backwards. So I think Kentucky has to really explore that. When you talk about history in reality, there's a movement when you talk about higher education, and Brother Thompson's right, Kentucky's moved a long way from its base, but understand its base was so incredibly low. In an annual study from Wallet Hub that looks at the best states in education, the new one just came out, Kentucky still ranks 43rd in the country overall, and 46 in higher education. There are only 50 states, so it ranks very, very low. So even though it's moved up from a much lower base. But what's happened in the midst of this hostility since we brought up HBCUs, and I won't get too deep into it, you're seeing a movement not just in Kentucky, but across the country where more talented black students are moving back to HBCUs. I mean, and they're being recruited even by Ivies, and they are choosing the Fisk, the Howards, the Morehouses, the Spelmans, the FAMUs of the world over quote unquote elite predominantly white institutions. And Walter Kimbrough, you know, one of my homeboys who was the president of Xavier most recently, Xavier, Louisiana. I didn't know there was a white Xavier until I moved here. I always thought it was just black Xavier in Louisiana. Then found out there was one. But I said, Walter, what do you think is going on? He said, look, man, to put it simply, black parents are tired of sending their children to these schools where they're going to be abused and psychologically damaged. You know, you talk to Walter about that. I'm bringing him in to speak in the fall so you can figure that out. But as you talk about history, even here, look at Kentucky State. Okay, governments, there was another recent study, I think it was last year, a year before, that looked at how much money the federal government and state governments had robbed HBCUs of. Kentucky State has been robbed of millions and millions of dollars, and there is no sustained conversation about that. They are owed. You want to just talk about the University of Louisville? Look at the history of the University of Louisville's relationship with Louisville Municipal College, which was really another iteration of Simmons, right, when you understand that history. And as people at the University of Louisville will celebrate Charles Parrish, you look at how the University of Louisville destroyed Simmons, destroyed it.
But where do we go from here? We have 2 minutes. Just
I'm saying it's very difficult to put this stuff in sound bites because you need to understand that and then move forward. So figure out, how can Kentucky State recover its money? What does the state of Kentucky owe Simmons? What does the University of Louisville owe Simmons? And how can you get it, right? How can you get some leaders in your black communities who are not as polite or divert conversations, whether it be in business, education, or politics? Until you do that, then I would contend that Kentucky does not have a bright future with improving black power dynamics, right? That's just the real conversation. That's where King got, that's where Du Bois got when he wrote a letter to his friend, as you said, when he went to Ghana, he said, the way things are set up right now, African-American, Negroes in America cannot win. So it could be that Kentucky is a lost state. I do not know. I do know I'm sending my daughter away.
Dr. Kerwood, you have the last word. We come to the end of this discussion, a very vibrant and direct discussion. You have the last word. Where do we go from here?
I want to come back to those intersections because as scholars, teachers, leaders sitting up here, we all bring our whole selves. So I happen to be the only woman sitting up here, just like Shirley Chisholm was the only woman, a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I bring a particular experience, but I also bring the experience of being from Massachusetts. I also bring the experience of being an openly lesbian leader, scholar. So I'm a particular person and I have a certain standpoint, but I bet there's a lot that I have to share also with my co-panelists. I mean, we've been on the same wavelength, I think, for a little while here. And so today, we have formed a coalition to come together and defend the ideas of, again, what I say, expanding democracy, bringing everyone to the dance, inviting them all to dance, and making sure everyone knows how to dance. We're all invested in that, and we've formed a coalition. You can do the same thing. We talk about these heroes. I talked about Shirley Chisholm. She's a hero, but she's also human. And I like to say she's a great example of the humans, for the humans of the present and the future to see themselves as heroes. The heroic thing you can do is to form a coalition with somebody who might not be the same as you.
I agree.
But you align yourselves together because you have aligned interests. And your aligned interests are going to push the state forward. We cannot be excellent at the University of Kentucky or as a public higher education system or as a state if we don't have everybody at the dancing.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give our audience our panelists a round of applause. You know, sometimes the unvarnished truth makes someone uncomfortable. But something someone said to me not so long ago, and I've been using it ever since. What you don't face, you can't fix. And I think that's where Kentucky is. I think that's where we all are. We have an opportunity if we seize it. And the question is, those who are in position to make those changes, to address the diversity in our society, to deal with questions of equity frontally and honestly, who recognize as a society we must come together and it must be inclusive because we all are part thereof and it will define our future. And those who negate what the past is, fail to realize is that we cannot be informed to take advantage of the opportunities to meet that future, to make a better society and life for us all. So I want to thank the panelists for this very direct and very honest exchange, in my opinion. I think you would agree. I think it's something that we should think about very deeply, those and you in the listening audience, wherever you may be. But if we face what we must face, then we can fix it together. God bless you all. Thank you. I want to introduce you now to Democratic Floor Leader Derek Graham of the House.
Thank you all. Again, thank you all for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, we wish to thank you for joining us at our 2024 Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus History Speakers, a series and a discussion about race. And we thank and appreciate the contributions of our esteemed, knowledgeable panel of educators and administrators, Dr. Cosby, my own Professor Dr. Harden, Dr. Kerwood, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Thompson. I think you will agree that the discussion was enlightening, informative, and insightful. And as we leave today, may the legacies of those who came before and those who are with us inspire us to keep striving toward our goals, keep fulfilling our dreams, and let our history empower us all to make a better world for all of us. The Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus would like to give special thanks to those who helped in the preparation of this event. We specifically wish to thank the Kentucky Historical Society for joining us in this correlation of, and look forward to many more. This is the final event of the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus Black History celebration this year. Thank you for joining us, and remember, Black history is American history. God bless you, God keep you, and God bless this Commonwealth.